Right now, millions of Americans are checking their bank accounts, checking their bills, and asking the same question. Why is everything getting more expensive? And where is the relief we were promised? Rent is higher, groceries cost more, gas is still unpredictable. And for many families, even one unexpected bill can push everything into chaos. You're working harder, but it feels like your money is working less. You hear about court rulings, tariffs, government debates, but what does that really mean for your paycheck and your future? And most importantly, what does it mean for the $2,000 checks people are still hoping for? Because today, a major court decision tied to Trump-era tariffs could quietly change the direction of economic relief in this country. And most people have no idea it's even happening. This is not just politics. This is not just headlines. This is about whether help is coming or slipping further away. And the part that should really get your attention? What happened in that courtroom could directly affect prices, inflation, and the government's ability to fund future payments. So, stay with me, because the real impact isn't obvious at first. But once you see how the pieces connect, you'll understand why your wallet is right in the middle of this story. What did the court actually decide? Let's break this down in simple terms, because the headlines can be confusing. A federal court recently ruled on challenges connected to tariffs that were put in place during the Trump administration. These tariffs were taxes on imported goods, especially from China. Companies paid them, but let's be honest, those costs were passed on to you at the checkout line. Everything from electronics to clothing to home supplies became more expensive. Now, several businesses and trade groups argued that some of these tariffs were applied without proper legal authority. They asked the courts to either roll them back or force the government to rethink how they were imposed. The court's decision did not immediately erase all tariffs, but it created new limits and legal risks for continuing them the same way. And here's where it matters. If tariffs are reduced or restructured, it changes how much money the government collects. And that affects what lawmakers can realistically promise when it comes to relief programs. So this ruling isn't about trade paperwork. It's about whether future economic support becomes easier or harder to pass. And that leads us to the next question. How does this connect to inflation and the pressure on your everyday costs? How tariffs hit your daily life. Most people never see the word tariff on a receipt, but you feel it every time you shop. When imports cost more, stores raise prices. When materials cost more, manufacturers raise prices. And when companies raise prices, inflation follows you everywhere. So even if tariffs sound like something far away in Washington, they quietly drain your wallet every single week. Now here's the tricky part. Tariffs can protect some American industries, but they also make everyday items more expensive for families who are already stretched thin. That means higher costs, and at the same time, more pressure on the government to step in with financial relief. But if tariff revenue drops because of court limits or policy changes, lawmakers suddenly have fewer dollars to work with. And that leads to tough political choices. Do they fund border security? Do they fund military spending? Or do they fund direct payments to families? This is where the $2,000 check conversation gets uncomfortable, because funding always comes before promises. And right now, the money math is getting tighter. But wait, because the next part of this story is where things get really serious. Why stimulus check talk is back again. Let's be real. Many Americans never fully recovered from the last few years of economic shocks. Credit card balances are higher, savings accounts are thinner, and wages have not kept up with real-life costs. So every time inflation spikes or prices jump, people naturally ask, is another round of stimulus possible? Some lawmakers and advocacy groups continue pushing for targeted relief, especially for seniors, disabled Americans, low-income workers, families with children. And yes, the number $2,000 keeps showing up in proposals and petitions. But here's the reality check. Congress doesn't vote based on hope. They vote based on budgets, revenue, and political pressure. And when court rulings affect how much money the government can collect through trade policy, it reshapes the entire financial playing field. That means even if politicians talk about checks, the money behind those checks becomes harder to guarantee. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth: most channels don't explain clearly. The main problem. Nobody is saying out loud here is the main problem, and it directly affects you. The government is facing rising costs, rising debt, and shrinking flexibility at the same time. Interest on national debt is exploding. Defense and disaster spending keeps growing. Healthcare and Social Security costs keep climbing. So when a court ruling reduces or complicates tariff collections, it adds pressure to an already tight budget. Now think about what happens next. Lawmakers start prioritizing. And when they prioritize, direct payments to citizens become politically harder to justify. Not because families don't need help, but because every dollar must now compete with multiple national emergencies. That's why the risk to future checks is not just political, it's financial. And this court decision just made the financial puzzle even harder to solve. But wait, because there's another layer to this story that could change everything. The political domino effect. Court rulings don't just affect money, they affect momentum. Once tariffs are legally challenged or limited, it opens the door for new lawsuits, new policy reversals, and major campaign promises built around economic nationalism. And with elections always on the horizon, politicians use trade and tariffs as powerful talking points. Some will argue, protect American jobs at all costs. Others will say, lower prices now, families can't wait. And while they argue, relief programs get stuck in the middle, because compromise becomes harder when trade becomes a political weapon. And here's what that means for you. The more divided the debate becomes, the slower relief moves through Congress. So even if lawmakers want to help, gridlock becomes the real enemy of your bank account. And now, here comes the part nobody expected. This is where it gets interesting. You might think tariff changes would lower prices quickly. But here's the truth most people don't hear. Even if tariffs are reduced, companies are not required to lower prices. Many businesses keep prices high to protect profit margins. Supply chains take months to adjust, and consumers rarely see immediate relief. So while government revenue may drop, your grocery bill might not. That means families could face the worst combination. Less government money, no immediate price relief, and that creates serious pressure on future economic support plans. This is why economists are warning that policy changes don't always translate into household relief. And that's why relying on future checks becomes more uncertain after court decisions like this. But wait, there is still one more factor that could shift the entire story. Congress still holds the final card. Even with court rulings, Congress still controls spending, which means lawmakers technically could approve relief checks if they choose to. But here's what makes it complicated. Any new payments increase the deficit. Any new taxes trigger political backlash. And cutting other programs sparks public outrage. So leaders walk a tightrope. They talk about helping families, but they hesitate when it comes to signing actual checks. And with tariff revenue now under legal pressure, that tightrope just got thinner. This doesn't mean help is impossible. It means help becomes harder to justify in budget negotiations. And when budgets get tight, politicians focus on what benefits the largest voting groups first. Which brings us to the next critical question: who gets protected first? When money gets tight, governments prioritize. Historically, the first protections go to Social Security, Medicare, veterans' benefits. These are considered politically untouchable, but broad stimulus checks for working families? Those become much harder to pass during budget stress. So while seniors and veterans may see cost of living adjustments, many working households are left waiting for trickle-down relief that never comes. And this is where frustration grows. Because you may feel like you're doing everything right, working, paying taxes, staying responsible. Yet relief always seems just out of reach. And when courts reshape economic policy, those delays stretch even longer, which leads us to the emotional reality behind all of this. The real cost is mental and emotional. Financial stress isn't just about numbers, it's about the anxiety of checking your balance, the fear of unexpected bills, the guilt of saying not this month to your kids. And when headlines tease relief that never comes, it adds another layer of emotional exhaustion. You start wondering, is anyone actually fighting for families like mine? Court rulings feel distant, but their ripple effects land right in your living room. And when economic systems shift without direct relief, people lose trust, not just in politicians, but in the future. Which is why stories like this matter, because understanding what's happening helps you prepare. And sometimes, preparation is the only power families get. But now let's talk about what could still change. What could turn this around? Here's the hopeful part. And yes, there is one. If tariffs are modified and trade costs drop, that could reduce long-term inflation pressure. And if inflation cools, the Federal Reserve may eventually lower interest rates. Lower rates mean cheaper loans, easier business expansion, more hiring opportunities. And that kind of economic improvement can sometimes replace the need for direct checks. So while $2,000 payments may become less likely, wider economic relief could still arrive in other forms. But that takes time. And time is exactly what struggling families don't always have, which is why political pressure still matters. A lot. Why your voice still matters. Every major relief program in history happened because public pressure became impossible to ignore. Lawmakers act when voters speak loudly, media keeps stories alive, and elections approach. That means staying informed is not passive, it's powerful. When people understand how court rulings, tariffs, and budgets connect, they stop falling for empty promises. And politicians respond faster when voters demand real solutions, not slogans. So even when court decisions seem final, policy is still shaped by public response. And that means your awareness matters more than you think. Which brings us to what you should be watching next. What to watch in the next few months here are the signals that could change everything. New trade negotiations, congressional budget fights, inflation reports, Federal Reserve announcements. If inflation drops sharply, stimulus talk may fade. If prices spike again, relief discussions could return fast. And if tariffs are fully restructured, that could force lawmakers to redesign economic support programs entirely. So this story is not over. This court decision is not the ending. It's the beginning of a new phase. And families who stay informed will be better prepared for what comes next. Now let's bring this all together. What this really means for you. So here's the bottom line, and it's important. This court ruling doesn't cancel checks, but it makes future payments harder to approve. It doesn't lower prices overnight, but it reshapes how the economy moves long term. And it doesn't solve financial stress, but it explains why relief feels so uncertain. Your financial future isn't controlled by one judge or one politician. It's shaped by a chain reaction of decisions that start with rulings like this, which is why understanding these moments matters. Because when big systems shift, families who are paying attention are less likely to be caught off guard. And now, let's end this with something powerful. Right now, your financial future is being shaped in courtrooms, in Congress, and in economic meetings you never see on TV. And whether help comes as lower prices, better jobs, or direct payments, one thing is clear. Staying informed is no longer optional. If you care about your family, your bills, and your future, you cannot afford to ignore stories like this. Because the next update could change everything, from inflation to benefits to the money in your account. So don't scroll past this. Don't tune this out. Stay connected. Stay informed. Subscribe for real updates that actually explain what's happening to your money. Turn on notifications so you don't miss critical changes that affect your benefits and your budget. And share this with someone who needs to understand what's really going on. Because when it comes to your wallet, you deserve facts, not false hope. And I'll be right here bringing you the next update.